Thank you. Very happy to be here with you guys today. And I just want to say thank you to Dr. Ilham for a very thorough and fantastic presentation on the history of Israeli occupation and foreign policy. My presentation is a little bit different. It's going to be through a narrative. As the introduction stated, I am the founder and editor-in-chief of MintPress News, and we very specifically cover special interest groups and how they influence policies right here at home and abroad. But we have a very, very heavy focus on US imperialism and war. And I would not have been interested in covering this topic unless, because it was because of my experience living under Israeli occupation as a child. When I was 9 years old, my parents packed up our bags and moved myself and my siblings out of the pristine, green, and serene, calm suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota. They moved us to Palestine. It was my first time there, and I could barely speak a word of Arabic. And when we had arrived, the first thing that I noticed as this young American preteen was that we had just moved into a police state. It was very hard not to notice how that was, with Israeli soldiers and police guarding the streets, guarding every corner of life, with bearing their guns. And so this was a very big culture shock for myself, coming from Minneapolis, Minnesota, with all of the freedoms that we are very lucky to have here in the United States. And just like most Americans, I didn't truly understand the country that my parents had come from, both being Palestinians. And so this was an opportunity that my parents wanted to give us to learn more about our culture and heritage. Because just like all Americans, I had been consuming the same media, the same mainstream corporate media that everybody else had consumed, that continuously showed people that were Muslim, that were from the Middle East, and especially Palestinians, in a very dehumanized way, where women are oppressed, they're uneducated, they cannot speak for themselves, and the men are all, dark-skinned, they're gun-bearing, they're angry, they abuse their wives, they don't allow for their women to be educated. And so, despite the fact that I was Palestinian, in the back of my subconscious, those were also the kinds of, media propaganda that had infiltrated our minds as well, even as youth. But when I moved to Palestine, I had seen something so beautiful. Although we had just moved into a police state, the culture of Palestinians was I was so enamored by it, by the people's kindness, by how much everybody loved Americans and wanted to know more about American culture and visit America. And the people there were just so kind-hearted and welcoming. Everybody wanted to welcome you into their home. And as a child, I would go to school within the first couple of years. I didn't speak Arabic, so I went to an American-speaking school. And I learned Arabic there and through my family. And that was my first time really experiencing the culture and the heritage of being Palestinian. So within the first couple of years, things were pretty calm, although it was very obvious that we were living in a police state, the Israeli soldiers bearing their guns, and there were some checkpoints from getting from the West Bank into Jerusalem. But it wasn't until the Second Intifada where things really took a huge turn for the worst. And that's when Israel began to prop up checkpoints almost in every corner of the West Bank, and it became extremely difficult to visit family members. And I remember going to school. My school that I went to was called Jerusalem School, and it was in Shafat, Jerusalem. And I would go to school after the Second Intifada had broken out, and the kids that were in my classroom, many of them would travel from Ramallah, from Ram, from the West, which is in the West Bank, to come to school. But after the Second Intifada, I would look around in my classroom, and about half of the seats were empty because these kids were being denied an education. They were being denied from crossing these checkpoints. And I will never forget when I would cross through checkpoints myself to go visit my family in Hebron or in Ramallah or in Ram. We would be sitting in our taxi, in our cabs, in our vans to cross through. And at many times, the taxi driver would yell at us to duck because Israeli soldiers were shooting children with rubber bullets. And I will never forget the images of children, literally 5, 6, 7-year-old kids, wearing their backpacks, trying to cross through, but Israeli soldiers wouldn't allow them to cross through checkpoints, denying them of an education. And so this was very traumatic for me as a young preteen. If you know anything about like brain development, this is the age where, you know, kids, a lot of, you know, they're developing their personalities, they're developing, you know, they're trying to understand the reality around them. And I was just so amazed at how this was the reality that Palestinians were living in. And, you know, one day we were sitting on the rooftop of our home in Shafat, and it just became, Israeli occupation had become so normalized in our lives that we knew that Israel was bombing homes, dropping bombs and laser bombs on homes in Ramallah. And we just thought it would be interesting to go and sit on a rooftop and watch this happen. That's how normal war and occupation became to Palestinians. We'd sit on our rooftops and we would just be sitting there crying, thinking about those families and those homes and wonder, you know, who's in that house? Is it a little kid like myself? Was it a mother? Was it a father? Was it a grandfather? Who was in that house? Did they make it alive? Those were the thoughts that crossed my mind every single day when I sat there, thinking about the children that were living under this occupation and under these bombs. Our water was regularly cut off. Whenever I'd visit family in Hebron or in Ramallah, many times we would have to stay inside and be inside because of curfews. Israel would impose curfews where nobody could leave. Sometimes it would last for weeks. Sometimes it would be a one-day thing. And if you even opened the curtain to look outside, you would be threatened with gunfire. And so there was always a lot of fear that was driven. And these Palestinians were living in fear. And, you know, one day my parents decided that as Americans, because we had experienced such a nice lifestyle in America, that we couldn't handle this lifestyle anymore. And so my parents decided to move us back to Minneapolis. Now at this time, I was about 13 years old. And when we had arrived in Minneapolis, the first thing that I noticed was just how green and still and pristine life was in America. Yet inside my mind was racing. It was racing, racing, racing. My heart was racing, and all I could think about were all the children in my classroom. Did they make it to school that day? Did, you know, my cousin Ibrahim, was he able to go to work on that day? Or, you know, just thinking about all of the elderly people that I would witness trying to cross through checkpoints, but because they didn't have the proper permit, they couldn't go see the doctor. I mean, I used to see this all the time, and I used to witness these people being lined up like animals to cross through these militarized checkpoints that are covered in barbed wire, and just looking around and thinking, how is this acceptable? How is this okay? And so while I had moved back to the United States and everything was so calm, my mind was racing. My anxiety levels were extremely, extremely high. I was about 12 and a half, almost 13 years old at this time. I'm officially becoming a teenager. And I was suffering what a lot of veterans suffered from when they come back from war, survivor's guilt and PTSD. I couldn't believe that I was living this life here in America so calm, with the ability to drink water, clean water for that matter, you know, being able to get up and go play in my very nicely trimmed lawn, going outside with no threats of war or anything like that, but remembering all the kids that I had left behind, and remembering my cousins and my aunts. And I remember that first week we arrived in Minneapolis, that first week, my aunt Zuhur, who was a principal to a girls' elementary school in forgot what the city was called, but it's near Beit Sahur. She had called us and said that they had to all leave the elementary school because settlers had planted a bomb in their school. And so this was just kind of the normal, regular life of Palestinians, the kind of fear that they had lived in. Every day was a matter of survival. And so I had started junior high at this time. I was now in the 8th grade. And the first thing that people would ask me, I had, you know, because I had come towards the end of the school year, it was around the month of April, and I had started school, and every kid would ask me, you know, where are you from? Where are you from? And, you know, this was like the suburbs of Minneapolis. Everyone was white, blonde, blue eyes. I had big, dark, curly hair. And, you know, I looked different, although I do have light skin. and I would say, I'm from Palestine, and I would just say it. And within 1 or 2 seconds, I would just start bawling and crying. There was just so many emotions that were built up and so much anxiety from everything that I had seen. And at that time, I would look around in my classroom, and these kids had no idea. They had no idea about anything when it comes to war, living in war, or just even having a basic inconvenience in their life. These kids were busy with sex, drugs, music, brand names. I mean, you name it. And this is how kids live today in America. And so this was, again, just like when I moved to Palestine, it was a culture shock. Now I was experiencing another culture shock. And so what I had done at this time, I was now 13 years old, and I wanted to keep up with what was going on in Palestine. And so I turned on my, my NBC, MSNBC, my CNN, my Washington Post, my New York Times, got the papers out, would buy newspapers, would buy magazines. I became obsessed with just knowing what was going on in Palestine. It just never left my mind. And I was so disturbed at how the media presented this narrative. And although I was only 13 years old, it was so obvious to me as this young person what was happening. And this was really my first time and really experiencing media propaganda. But the way the media presented the Israel-Palestinian conflict was always through the lens of an equal level playing field. It was Israelis versus Palestinians, as if there was no occupation and no apartheid state. And it was always presented through the lens of religion. It was Muslim versus Jew. Never, ever, ever any mention of the discrimination that Palestinians faced. Never any mention of how Palestinians were living under a police state. And so when I was watching the media coverage, I would see the media always presenting Israel as this beacon of democracy in the Middle East, surrounded by, these uncivilized neighbors, and these poor Israelis, they have to deal with these very uncivilized Palestinians. Palestinians were continuously showed within media. Whenever Palestinians would be presented in the media, images of Hamas were always shown, where they were, men, dark men wearing guards on their face and masks on their face, bearing guns, calling death to Israel, all of these things. And then showing children making chants, and, women, always looking sad and oppressed. And it was never the real stories and the people that I had seen, that I had witnessed firsthand, which were the people that, the old man that I will never forget trying to cross the checkpoint, trying to get to the hospital. His wife was trying to take him, but they didn't have the right permit, so they couldn't go. Or the family that lived literally across the street from me, who had their entire home bulldozed, this historic home that was over 100 years old, bulldozed because they didn't have the proper permit. This home was literally older than the state of Israel. And it was bulldozed right before my eyes. They never showed the stories of these children trying to cross through checkpoints, trying to go and get an education. It was never those stories. And through that experience of me witnessing this, I became obsessed with media. And from that moment on, when I was 13 years old, I decided I will be their voice. I will be the voice of Palestinians and all people that live under the boot of Western imperialism and the military-industrial complex. And so from there, I started to pursue journalism. It became my goal. It was all I ever talked about. I was extremely motivated and determined. And it was in high school when I actually decided to, first year of college, I would say, I decided to wear the hijab. And I, wanted to continue to pursue journalism. But people around me and my family actually told me, no one's going to hire you because you wear the hijab. No one's going to take you seriously. Now, we were living, obviously, in a time of post 9/11, where there's a lot of Islamophobia, where Palestinians and Muslims altogether were constantly and are still dehumanized till this day. And so even within the Palestinian Muslim community at this time, there wasn't a lot of hope. There wasn't a lot of motivation for girls, Palestinian women, especially if they wore hijab, to even join and be within the media. And it was because of instances like after September 11th, when I believe it was CNN, and the first headline that they showed and video that they showed were Palestinians passing out candy in Gaza, celebrating. And of course, they made it appear as if they were celebrating 9/11, and they didn't actually give the proper context that this was footage that was recorded a year prior for Eid celebrations. They had planted the story very specifically to show that Palestinians were celebrating 9/11. And this was another instance of just me sitting, watching this imagery in my classroom. I will never forget this after 9/11. And kids in my classroom were telling me, like, look at what your people are doing. They're celebrating 9/11. Your people did this. And so these kinds of things built up. They built up in the psyche of a lot of the Arabs and Muslims in the United States to demotivate them from, joining the media. But this actually, all it did was put a fire under my feet to want to make a difference and become that voice to change the media landscape, to really truly represent what was happening on the ground in Palestine. And by the way, I believe it was about a month later, CNN, after several letters were sent to CNN, they ended up retracting. They posted one little retraction on their website, saying that was a mistake and they shouldn't have posted that video footage. And so, despite being told over and over again by family members, by people within my community that no one's ever going to hire you, Mnar, like, don't, and you're Palestinian American, no one's going to take you seriously, nobody wants to hear what you have to say. All that did was motivate me, because if you've ever met a Palestinian woman, we are very strong, outspoken women, and all that really does is just put a fire underneath our feet to continue to pursue whatever it is that we're trying to pursue. And in this case, it wasn't even about me. I just wanted to provide some sort of platform to speak up for those living under the boot of Western imperialism. And so my journey into journalism, 80s American media comprised of over 50 corporations. And after 9/11, the media consolidation went down to 6 corporations. We're actually moving now into 5 corporations that own all of American corporate media. That's all of the newspapers, all of the radio stations, all of the media websites, all of the radio programs, the TV stations. Everything is owned by just 6 corporations. And what had happened is we saw this huge shift in who the media was now representing. The media went from representing the people somewhat to now being owned by the entities that the media was meant to hold accountable. Now we had these billionaires, we had weapons manufacturers, we had these pro-war think tanks becoming now the new owners of the media, and not to mention foreign entities like the state of Israel directly having influence over media organizations, and Saudi Arabia having direct influence on media organizations. And these entities all represent this elitist US capitalist class that really represent the 1% that are pro-war, that are pro-Israel, that are pro-US hegemony around the world. And that's why we see a constant dehumanization of Palestinians. What Israel represents in the Middle East is a proxy state. It's a proxy state, it's a colonial state that represents the interests of the United States and Western colonial powers. And so with this consolidation, that's why we saw this huge shift in the way Palestinians were being treated and covered within the media. Some names, worthy names that have a lot of ownership over not just more conservative media, but also neoliberal medias like Vice News and BuzzFeed. These are organizations that pander to millennials and to the left under the guise of progressive. They appear to be progressive and cool and hip and all of those things, but actually what they are is they're heavily influenced by neoconservative thought and pro-Israel think tanks, including Rupert Murdoch, Sheldon Adelson, pro-Israeli think tanks like the Atlantic Council, and then pro-US government propaganda arms like the Board of Broadcasting Governors, which is basically like a legal arm of US propaganda. I mean, that's literally what it is. They influence these organizations to push that US hegemonic agenda. What we do know, and what I learned throughout the years, is that organizations like the New York Times receives regular gag orders by the state of Israel on the state of Israel to tell the New York Times what they can and cannot publish about Israel and Palestine. We do know that the paper of record ethnically cleansed a Palestinian family's home in Jerusalem so that they can build their Jerusalem bureau. We do know that the bureau chief that lives there and that works there, that represents the New York Times, their children are in the Israeli military. And so we have these very, very grand conflict of interest at play here at these major mainstream corporate outlets that are supposedly, the paper of record or a trustworthy news organization. In 2014, it was revealed that BuzzFeed was receiving money from the Israeli Defense Forces to act as the official mouthpiece of the IDF. I mean, this is insane, like a military organization, not that it's surprising after everything I've mentioned, but it's really insane to think that in this country, in the United States, where we uphold our First Amendment and the freedom of the press, a press that is meant to act as the fourth estate, that's meant to represent the people and educate the people and empower we the people with information that helps us hold our elected officials accountable. We have media organizations that directly represent and take money from very shady organizations that do not work in the interest of human rights or the interest of democracy, for that matter. And so BuzzFeed in 2014 became the official mouthpiece of the Israeli Defense Forces so that they can influence millennials to support the state of Israel and to dehumanize Palestinians. And so these are just a couple of examples of major conflict of interest and how the very people the media is meant to hold accountable have become the media. Now, I don't want to ramble on and on and on, but the whole reason I started MintPress, we're a leading independent media organization in the United States that I'm very, very proud to have built, is to balance this very corrupt system that we have in the United States that will allow for a voice for not just Palestinians, by the way, but to also expose the very special interests at play that are influencing the media, that are working hand in hand with the very entities the media should be holding accountable. And so we have done for the past, we're almost at 9 years. I can't believe it. Our 9-year anniversary is coming up. But we have helped expose these entities like the New York Times, like BuzzFeed, like Vice News. We've also written a lot of exposés about how Israel silences opposition and dissent online as well. MintPress has become a target of that for many years. I personally have been the subject of many smear campaigns and attack campaigns by organizations tied to these pro-Israel think tanks. Our MintPress Wikipedia page, we wrote this big expose about how, I forgot what the name of the lobby is, but it's a pro-Israel lobby that we caught editing our Facebook page to dehumanize me as a Palestinian American editor, and to kind of make our coverage seem as though it's, pro-Iran or pro-Syria. They use that terminology to make independent journalists and voices of dissent appear as the others, so that we can be dehumanized and dismissed as conspiracy theorists or pro this or pro that, when in fact we are the ones who are actually doing the job of media, which is upholding the First Amendment and ensuring that the media represents the interests of the people, human rights, social justice, and actual democratic values. Thank you.